this morning I have the pleasure of inviting you, Therese Rytter, as our guest at this David Horn podcast, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. A warm welcome.
Thank you very much.
Therese, you and me know each other quite well after years where our paths have crossed, but our listeners might not be familiar with who you are and what you do in your daily work. Could you give us a short introduction?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. Yes, so my name is Therese Rytter. I'm a human rights lawyer by training, and I am the director of prevention and accountability at the Danish Institute Against Torture Dignity based in Copenhagen. And I've been working in this field of international human rights for the last 30 years, so essentially my entire career. And in addition to this, I also have been a member of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture over the last almost 12 years.
Fascinating. To me, to be honest, a Danish Institute Against Torture, that's an interesting office.
It is an interesting office, definitely. It's a human rights development and health organization that works in some 15 countries worldwide. Of course, we also work in Denmark, but in a number of other countries worldwide in order to try to prevent the occurrence of torture and other forms of ill treatment, and also to pursue accountability. So bringing perpetrators to justice and making sure that victims also are able to receive redress.
Interesting. As far as I know, Denmark actually holds quite an important position when it comes to torture in the international community, doesn't it?
That's very right. Denmark has for several decades sort of been the lead nation internationally in the fight against torture. So both in the United Nations General Assembly, in the UN Human Rights Council, they are the ones tabling resolutions that in every year increases the legal protection against torture. And also they are supporting a number of programs worldwide which seek to put these legal frameworks into practice to make sure that this is implemented and, is carried out in everyday life, whether it's policing or prison regime.
Fascinating and also reassuring. That's what you should expect from a well-established liberal democracy like Denmark. But you also mentioned that you hold a position in the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, the CPT. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right, yes.
Could you explain what exactly is that?
Sure. I mean, so the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture is an expert body. It's part of the Council of Europe, and the Council of Europe is, of course, an international human rights and democracy organization that includes 46 member states in Europe, all the way from Norway in the south to Cyprus in the north, Cyprus in the south, UK, and all the way to Turkey, Azerbaijan. And our role essentially is to help states prevent any kind of practice of torture or other forms of inhuman or degrading treatment.
And for how long have you been in this organization or this position?
Well, almost 12 years now. So I'm ending my third mandate, and I cannot be re-elected anymore. So I've served my time in the CPT.
Fantastic, and I have to say thank you for the work you're doing there. It's fascinating that you've been there for 12 years.
No, absolutely, and it's been a pleasure. I mean, an extremely important work, which I feel very honored to have been part of this hugely important endeavor, because the CPT has a very, very particular and unique mandate, which no other international body has. As you may know, the CPT carries out visits to all the 46 member states. So if we move into police stations, prisons, psychiatric hospitals, anywhere where a person can be deprived of their liberty. So we sit inside the cells and we speak with people in police custody or people who are in prison to understand what their conditions of life are, how they're being treated by the staff. But we also speak with staff and we also speak with management so that we can really make a very sort of thorough assessment, also looking into, of course, files, records, CCTV footage. So we have a very professional methodology of collecting evidence and then speaking with, of course, at the end of the day, the national government to try to make recommendations on how one can strengthen the protection against torture and inhuman treatment.
Fascinating. So how your committee has a mandate then that is approved by the governments in all of these countries in the European Council?
Yes, that's right. So every single country, there is an international, a European convention, and all of these states have actually acceded to this convention. And they have allowed the CPT to carry out visits into any place of detention within the jurisdiction of the state and to cooperate with the CPT in good faith. So yes, this is a commitment that they've all made voluntarily.
I see. And how does it work then, practically? If you're going to do an inspection of a country, what would typically be the process and how you actually do it?
Sure. So we will be a delegation from the CPT of independent experts, people who have backgrounds as lawyers, as medical doctors, maybe with a specialization in prison medicine. It may be a psychiatrist, it may be a former police commissioner. So we make sure, depending on what exactly we want to do in the country, that we have the expertise on board to be able to assess at a very professional level, of course, exactly what the situation is like. And then these delegations, say a delegation of 10 persons, will be notifying the state, saying we will now in 3 weeks or in 4 weeks be visiting your country, and we would like to be given credentials to be able to enter any place. Once we step foot in the country, we get the credentials from the government, we meet with them, we try to understand what has been the recent development. They will explain to us, what progress has been made. They may also explain to us what challenges they still have. And from then on, we do fact-finding. So for 2 weeks, we'll work in the country. We will move into these police stations and prisons. Most of them are not notified in advance that we will come to them. We may notify 1 or 2 prisons, but for the rest, it will be a surprise visit. And the police stations, we can turn up around the clock. We may turn up very often Friday night. People have been on the town, there's been some fights, so we might be in a police station around midnight Friday or Saturday evening. And then we'll do our work, fact-finding. We'll be interviewing those persons who are arrested and detained. Our medical and forensic doctors will examine them, take photos of any injuries. We'll look into medical files. We will look into files about use of force, for instance. So there's a whole methodology of how we actually collect all the information that we need in order to assess how people are being treated. So for 2 weeks, we do this in many police stations and many prisons throughout the country, not only in the capital, but we also go to very remote areas. And at the very end of this visit, we'll then meet with the state again. So this will be the Minister of Interior, for instance, the head of police, the Minister of Justice, the head of the prison system, and we will then present our preliminary observations to them, explaining what are the good practices that we've seen, but also, more importantly, what are the concerns that we have? Where do we see that there is a continuing pattern of violations of either inhuman, degrading treatment, or in some cases, even patterns or practices of torture?
So, well, this is a very broad question. It's fascinating to hear that. So you can actually talk to suspects in custody cells or inmates in prisons directly.
Yes, and anyone. We have the right unimpeded right to move into these areas, to choose exactly who we want to interview and to interview them in private. So it will not be those persons that the police commissioner will tell us to interview, but we choose the ones we want to speak with. And we will always insist that there is no police officer or prison guard present, because these conversations need to be confidential, because otherwise the person that we speak with will not dare speak the truth necessarily.
May I ask you, I've a police officer background, but from Norway, and I haven't been able to access any prisons or custody cells except from in my own country. Can you give us a little bit idea what you see around Europe?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we see the whole spectrum in Europe. We see some countries which have, modern custody cells. Some have even custody suites, so entire areas modernized with good physical conditions where you have daylight, you have a bed, you have the facilities that you need, and these which are the minimum requirements. They would also have access to an outdoor yard if they are kept there for more than 24 hours. They would get meals served, they would have contact with the family. So this is at the very good end of the scale. And of course, on the other end of the scale, we also see very small, dark, sometimes even pitch dark cells without any daylight at all. And where people are locked up, they get no food or very little food. They have limited contact with the family and they don't have any access. They may be locked up in these places for many, many days in a row with limited access to a toilet, for instance. So really, I would say even within Europe, and one might be surprised, that we do see from all the range from A to Z.
I see. So just in one end, you have, if you think about what is actually torture, it can be anything from just being locked up, I guess, and the pressure in itself by being in isolation, and on the scale towards direct physical ill treatment and violence.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a whole scale, one could say. Torture, of course, is on the very high end. Torture is the most extreme form of ill treatment. And it's very defined very particularly where you inflict severe pain and suffering. You do this intentionally. It's done by someone who is a law enforcement officer, and it's done for a specific purpose. It could be to punish a person, it can be to extract a confession, to intimidate, but really torture is at the extreme end of the scale. If we speak about Europe, the torture methods that we see, it could be severe beatings, it could be electroshocks, it can be suspension, it can be waterboarding. But this is really at the very far end. The situation that we would see in police custody, of course, it can during an interview, sometimes also amount to torture. But we also see what we would label as inhuman treatment or degrading treatment. So if you get locked up in a police cell for 3 days, you don't get a lot of water, just a little bit, you don't have natural light. I mean, that in itself will not be torture, but it will still be a violation of the prohibition of inhuman treatment or degrading treatment.
Exactly. And in combination, it might have the same effect. As you said, if the purpose was to make someone confess, let's say, a crime they did or did not do, the ill treatment itself can be an important factor there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a combination of factors. And at the end of the day, it will be, in Europe, it will be the European Court of Human Rights, ultimately, who will decide whether some kind of ill treatment is actually inhuman treatment or whether it's torture. The CPT is not a judicial body, so we will not label different kinds of ill treatment. Our role is really to prevent that this takes place in the first place.
Exactly. Now, it just takes me back, Therese, to my old days as detectives in Oslo police headquarters, where I have to admit that we were quite unaware of what we were dealing with when we held people in custody over weeks and weeks and months and months. And I was myself interviewing these suspects, and if they didn't kind of cooperate, we just kind of made it clear that, well, your custody will be prolonged. And I don't think I personally ever told them to kind of confess or say what I wanted them to say, but it was quite clear, even if you didn't say that, what they probably should say to make, to lift the isolation in custody. So what you're saying is actually taking me back to our own practice in Norway, which I at that time thought was probably all well, but later it actually occurred to me that in the police, if you want to handle, let's say, tear gas or things like that, you have to try it. What is it like to get tear gas in your eyes? I remember I was saying, if you are supposed to be a detective who deal with people in custody and isolation, you probably should try what it's like to stay a weekend just in total isolation, what that really does to your brain and all that.
Absolutely. I think anyone who has any role in putting people in solitary confinement, whether it's a court, whether it's a prosecutor, in principle, anyone who would order measures of this kind, which are very restrictive, ought to know what it is all about, being placed in solitary confinement or whatever the measure is. Of course, that's crucial.
I remember my dear friend Asbjørn Raklev, who I'm so happy to say, as you know very well, he's the Norwegian representative in your committee. I got around 20 years ago, we discussed this with the Norwegian Director of Public Prosecutions, because we were trying to reform the practices around suspect interviewing in Norway at the time, and we found the reports from the committee very interesting when we first actually found out that they existed. And I remember at that time there were particularly two things that the committee addressed when it came to Norway. That was a really bad culture of very long use of custody and isolation, and the lack of recording of interviews.
Yeah. Well, that's not the case anymore, huh?
Exactly, but that was in the late 1990s.
Right.
And I remember, I was a relatively young man at that time, and a naive believer in, Norway as a liberal democracy. So I asked people from the Director of Public Prosecutions Office, what do you think about this? Why don't we address these concerns? But they were just kind of, I vividly remember one said to me, but Ivar, they just have to write something about Norway as well. It's not that serious,
Yeah.
I had the feeling it wasn't really taken seriously, Therese.
No, I can imagine that. And of course, unfortunately, we still see this today. I mean, now, of course, Norway has introduced recording of interviews, but we still see across Europe that a large number of countries are still not recording interviews, neither with suspects nor with victims or witnesses. So in that sense, a number of countries have introduced both this kind of audio or visual recording and also have reformed their ways of interviewing, but a large part are still where you described Norway was 20 years ago.
Well, speaking of that, I think your country, Denmark, still don't have an obligation to record their suspect interviews.
No, we don't. We don't.
Which is quite appalling if you think about the position that we mentioned early in this interview. So well, I won't ask you about your meaning about it, but I think it's interesting to reflect that countries that even have these kind of positions, and that's why I wanted to touch upon that. Sometimes we also have to look into our own practices, even though we think about ourselves as highly developed democracies. There probably are practices going on even here that definitely could interfere with these things.
This is very true, and I mean, what we also see, of course, is that certain countries are progressing over time. They get more refined methods. They are complying with human rights standards increasingly. But we also see countries that regress. They go back. They may have had practices which were better in the past, but then for different reasons or in particular situations, they are then abandoning those practices. So it's a dynamic situation, and that's why the CPT cannot just say, well, once and for all, now we have visited Norway, for instance. Norway is good in a number of fields, so you have now reached the point where you don't need any more independent monitoring. That's not the case, because any country can fall back.
Absolutely. I was thinking, also wanted to ask you, and because I know through personal communication that with my good friend Aspen Rackler and also with yourself, that apart from inspecting on how they actually physically and mentally treat prisoners in custody cells and in mental institutions, prisons, you also kind of, you should say, strengthens your focus on how they are interviewed, interview methods.
Yes, we do. We do. I mean, for us, of course, interviewing methods are crucial. I should say that the CPT's original focus, of course, in terms of safeguard, has been on what we call the trinity of rights. So this is that anyone who is arrested and detained by the police should have the right to notify their family that they have been detained or another third party. Secondly, they should also, of course, have a right to a lawyer. And thirdly, they should have the right to a doctor, so that any doctor, of course, can also verify whether the person may have bruises on their body that perhaps originate from the arrest. So this is really sort of what we call the trinity of rights, and being informed of these is really, really key. And this has been sort of a standard from the CPT from the very, very outset. But what we have also said for more than 25 years is, of course, that interviewing is absolutely crucial, and that the sole purpose of interviewing should be to obtain accurate and reliable information about the matter which is under investigation, and not to obtain a confession by someone who might, in the eyes of the officers, be guilty. So the presumption of innocence is crucial, and this is a key principle that the CPT has been applying since the very early days.
When you say just that, you take me back to a very important standard that you recommended all the way back in 2002. That was the year after we started our national interview training in Norway, and I can't tell you how important that standard was to us, Therese, because me and Asbjørn Rakla were quite young officers at that time, trying to kind of reform a relatively conservative organization like Norwegian Police and Prosecution Service, and finding that kind of standards from a European body like the one you are representing was so important to us as young officers, and it meant so much to see, okay, so it's not just an idea that we have after having studied a bit in the UK. There are other people, and not only people, but very important institutions that had the same idea.
Exactly. No, that's very true. And of course, I mean, the CPT was also very heavily inspired by the member states that it visited. And of course, the United Kingdom was one of the main countries at the time who had introduced the peace model. Of course, examining the UK and finding this good practice was something that we also took on board. Yeah, so making sure that, one should proceed from the evidence to the suspect rather than from the suspect to the evidence. And this has been a principle underpinning all the work that we do when we look into police custody.
It's really fascinating, and I hope that the same inspiration that you gave us many years ago can probably still necessary in many places around the world. I know that even people from within the organization are struggling with how they are being treated, and respect from director levels about why this is necessary to kind of, are you with us? Are you against us? They're saying that things are not okay in our country. You kind of expect it to be loyal.
I can imagine, of course. We see, of course, the police is also protecting themselves. I mean, it's something that we see as well, that very rarely do we see, when we discover that there are practices of coercive interrogation or other forms of physical ill treatment, police custody. It's quite rare that we see very effective investigations and ending up in prosecutions, and actually law enforcement officers being brought to justice. So I think in a number of countries in Europe, there is still a way to go.
Yeah, I can say even in this season of Beyond a Reasonable Doubt podcast, there are some officers in some European countries who are very reluctant to accept my invitation. Although they are really honored to be invited, they are really afraid to speak openly about what their country need to do to change.
Yes. No, I can very much recognize that.
So again, I think they should look into the reports from the CPT and see if they can find at least support there, as we did. I would then ask you, Therese, because you said then it means that you are now on it. Do you understand correctly? When you now come for an inspection in a country, would you also look for whether officers are trained or they have a policy on how they do the interviews?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we look, of course, at what happens within the place of detention. But if you really want to prevent any kind of ill treatment, you need to look outside the place of detention as well. So we will look at a number of systemic factors. We will look at, of course, how the police is trained. If, for instance, at the police academy, there is in the curriculum also training on how to interview suspects or victims or witnesses, and whether this kind of interviewing methodology is something that complies with investigative interviewing and good modern practices. We will also look at the legislation behind, for instance, to see whether, if ever there is a confession which has been obtained through torture, well, will that confession make it all the way to court? Will the judge in that case dismiss the evidence? This is crucial. We will look into also instructions, interrogation rules, and see whether these are compliant with international standards. So it's a whole range of issues that we look at, both inside the place of detention, but also outside. Because only through this kind of holistic examination are we able to propose measures which are relevant to strengthen the protection against ill treatment.
Exactly. As much as you know, I've been spending much of my professional life trying to introduce investigative interviewing to the Norwegian Police and Prosecution Service, but also in my position at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, we also work globally with these ideas. And at some point, as a police officer, you think maybe interviewing is the thing. As long as you do this, all will be good. But sometimes I think we also have to take into account the broader context that you are talking about. It's not just one factor here that will, make this look good or not good. It's the whole picture.
It's the whole picture, absolutely, and it's very much the culture. So it's the culture beginning within the police. What kind of a culture is it? Is it seen as professional to do interviews in a investigative manner, or is it seen as acceptable to do coercive interviews? I mean, this is really where it starts. How does the superior within the police react if someone has forced a confession? But it also moves into the prosecution service. Are they willing to accept confession extracted under torture? Are judges willing to also close their eyes? So it starts with the police, but it does not only focus on the police. It's really key to have all the justice institutions on board in this. And of course, ultimately, the political level, because it's at the end of the day, the Minister of Justice or the Minister of the Interior who will decide what kind of practice do we want to see in a particular country.
Exactly. That takes me to a delicate question, because you mentioned the presumption of innocence, which is a fundamental right for any suspect. And I still see that even scientists around Europe are engaged in what they call how to make a suspect talk. That will make people cooperate with you, even though they did not want to cooperate with you in the beginning. And sometimes I feel a bit awkward even today when I said, well, is it your job as a police officer to make someone talk if they already have said, I don't want to give a statement in this case?
Sure. No, I mean, of course, the police have to respect the presumption of innocence and also the right to remain silent. So if a criminal suspect does not wish to say anything, there's not much they can do. Then they would have to, of course, collect other forms of evidence through other sources, documentary or otherwise. But absolutely, I mean, one cannot force a suspect to speak, and even less so force a suspect to confess.
Exactly, but very often that the force thing, the physical, or that's more understood. But when they sweet talk them, you have a famous professor in the Netherlands called Peter van Koppen, who's written a really good piece on what he calls sweet interrogations, where they actually are more or less manipulating people, befriending them, and all these kind of methods that is not in itself illegal, but it's done within the context that you have people in isolation. And then you are manipulating them into doing things that not necessarily is in their interest. So I think it's really interesting that people have to understand what is the job. A police officer, in my view, is there to uphold and make sure that this suspect have got the rights and they're able to act on these rights, not to talk them out of it.
Of course, what you say, sweet talk, is perhaps on the lower end. I mean, of course, that should not happen. The manipulation should not happen. But what we are looking at is not that kind of thing necessarily. We will look at more serious practices, such as, for instance, if you have sleep deprivation, that a person is interviewed for many, many hours, is not able to sleep, is not able to have breaks during the interview, is perhaps not fed well, maybe during the interview be exposed to threats of torture, threats of rape, threats against their family. So these are things which of course, are extremely serious, and these are the ones that we pay a lot of attention to. If it comes across that we get allegations of that.
Absolutely, and I acknowledge that. I just, and you have to excuse me, I'm just more or less reflecting on the total, the understanding of a legal officer, that seems to still be a culture that is in the police interest that a suspect talks. I really question that, whether police should have any interest in whether a suspect talk or not. And that's the kind of the cultures that I think we still have to struggle with. Yes, the detective, should you have any interest in the outcome of this case?
No, I think we still see countries where people within the police will also be rewarded if they have, a high number of cases that they have solved.
Exactly.
They may be rewarded by getting better bonuses or better salaries, or even getting promotion. And of course, for many, it may be that they see that it's a shortcut to solving a case, to extract a confession. Obviously, this is something that we in the CPT are also attentive to.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's so important, because you mentioned it is in the police cultures, and if you want to make changes here, you have to work with those cultures and what is really your job here. And I remember when I did research on my PhD on what we call tipping points in decision making, factors that can make you fall into, let's say, tunnel vision towards guilt. I remember one of my interview objects in England, he said that even the fact that you have been a police officer, on the street, where your job is to control crime and stop it, even that will be a tipping point. He said, if you're really going to be a detective, you probably will be a little bit tainted just by the fact that you come from a uniformed police background. So I remember that was a really deep insight in what that does with you. Because investigation is definitely not about control, and it is meant to be an objective gathering of relevant information.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree.
I'm really impressed by the work and what you have spent most of your professional life doing, and I'm really thankful for what you have meant to our country. It was really important to have these reports when we started to try to reform Norway. And I'm not saying everything is good in Norway. It isn't, but it was an important contribution.
No, I'm very happy to hear that, because of course this is the main gist of our work, to make sure that we can help as many states as possible with tailor-made recommendations that speak to the very concrete context that we see. And of course, the more reports are made public, the more it can also help more broadly in the country. And we have also a trend internationally now, which is quite interesting, that a number of states have said that they are willing to have what is called automatic publication of the reports, which mean that, we issue the report, we'll send it to the government, and within a matter of a few weeks, they will, of course, do some fact-checking, but otherwise they will make the report public. And this is a really good practice, because it means that not only the government and the different institutions, the police, the prison, would know what happened, what we said, but also civil society and much more broadly in society. And this is a very good practice. So we're seeing an increasing number of states, of course, moving in that direction.
Absolutely. And also talking to you, Therese, reminds me of a very important thing, because I think both of us are involved in a European project called Mendez, which is a funded project to kind of spread the understanding of the importance of legal safeguards and scientifically based interview methods across Europe. But sometimes it seems to be an over focus on just the interviewing methods.
I agree. And I think, as we talked about before, interviewing methods are key, but it's not only about the moment in which you're interviewed, it's also about what happened before. Exactly. So what we see in a number of countries is, for instance, that people get arrested, and already upon arrest, the informal talks, as we call them, will start. So police officers, it may even at this stage be operational police officers, not investigators, they will start questioning the suspect. Where was he? What did he do? What has he committed? And asking questions which should not take place without the presence of a lawyer. And we see this time and again, this practice. So it's also about not looking only at the official interview with the investigator, but to see what happened before, what kind of pressures were put on the person before. And of course, all the safeguards that we talked about also, with the right of access to a lawyer, the right of access to a doctor, the right to be put before a judge to make sure that the detention is actually lawful. So all of these safeguards build a fence to make sure that the right to respect for integrity and dignity is upheld at the end of the day.
We could go on with this. I couldn't agree more. I just want to underline the fact that none of this happens in isolation. And that was the point with my story from my old days, where we kept people in custody cell over prolonged periods. And I didn't quite see the problem. But of course, if you combine that, you don't even have to ask a leading question. You could probably ask an open-ended question and still get the answers they know you want. So all this has to be balanced, and only then can we really move forward.
No, I agree. I very much agree.
So, but I have to say, I really encourage our listeners to go into your webpage, the CPT, European Council, and look into the national reports, but also not only the national reports, but your annual recommendations and reports, and what to see how that can inspire for development in all these areas.
Exactly. And I can also recommend anyone to look into the resources, because we have a long list also of standards and good practices that we collect on different topics within the police, within the prison system, within the psychiatric hospitals, within immigration detention centers. So all these areas in which people can be deprived of their liberty, we have standards and good practices. So I would encourage, of course, anyone to read reports on specific countries, but also to look more generally at the generic standards, because these at the end of the day are what anyone should aspire to comply with.
Thanks a lot, Therese, and thanks a lot for a lovely conversation. I've learned a lot.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak with you, as always, and always very inspiring.
Thanks a lot.